What if the final thing you ever said was a joke, a prophecy, a food review? History remembers last words like they're sacred, but sometimes they're absurd, accidental, or eerily perfect. From presidents misreading calendars to poets disappearing mid-sentence, these are 49 strange, unsettling, and strangely human farewells. No myths, no redos, just one shot at saying something before the credits roll. So lean in, because the dead are about to speak, and not one of them sticks to the script. 1. Thomas Jefferson. Is it the 4th? There's something quietly tragic about a man mistaking his own death day by a few measly hours. As if time, that smug gatekeeper of final exits, decided to mock him one last time. Thomas Jefferson, the quill behind the Declaration of Independence, died asking, "Is it the 4th?" He was close. He died on July 4th, 1826, just not quite at the hour he thought. That question, half-conscious and quietly desperate, reads less like a calendar check and more like a personal negotiation. Jefferson had calculated his death to coincide with the symbolic birthday of the country he helped forge. It's romantic, or maybe just narcissistic. He wanted to go out in rhythm with America, like a symphony reaching its last swell. But death, as it turns out, doesn't do requests. Still, history obliged in its own ironic way. Because, in one of those absurdly poetic coincidences that make you believe in either fate or cosmic sarcasm, John Adams, Jefferson's rival, frenemy, and co-architect of the Republic, died on the exact same day. Hours apart. On the 50th anniversary of the Declaration they both signed. Which brings us to John Adams. Thomas Jefferson survives. He didn't. Jefferson had already died, silently just hours before. Adams, unaware, muttered those final words as he lay in his own deathbed haze. Thomas Jefferson survives. It wasn't a compliment. It was a jab, a final one. Because for all their shared ideals, Adams and Jefferson spent decades politely loathing each other, writing flowery letters that barely masked deep-seated ideological contempt. Think of them as the Hamilton and Burr of brainy passive aggression. And here, at the very end, Adams believed that Jefferson, his philosophical foil, had outlived him. Again. But he hadn't. In a twist of historical timing so on the nose it feels scripted, Jefferson had died just hours earlier. So Adams, unknowingly, claimed a false second place. Or perhaps, as some revisionists suggest, he meant it sarcastically. Not a lament, but an accusation. Thomas Jefferson survives. Not in body, but in the haunting persistence of his ideals. Either way, Adams died believing he had lost. But history decided it was a draw, or maybe just a punchline with perfect timing. The country they co-authored was turning 50 that day. Fireworks were being lit, speeches given. And somewhere in a quiet room, two giants of history were whispering their goodbyes, too proud to admit they'd become echoes. And then, there's this next guy. Not a firework, more of a flickering candle. Less founding father, more emotionally repressed workaholic with a soft spot for one woman. 3. James K. Polk. I love you, Sarah. For all eternity, I love you. Here lies the weird part. Polk was not exactly known for being warm. His contemporaries described him as efficient, disciplined, and emotionally inaccessible. If Jefferson died trying to stage manage his own patriotic demise, Polk died trying to whisper his way into eternity through a rare confession. To his wife. The same woman he rarely saw because he was too busy micromanaging manifest destiny. And yet, those were his final words. I love you, Sarah. For all eternity, I love you. Twice, just to be clear. It's sweet, but also suspicious. A romantic gesture from a man who had reportedly spent his presidency working 12-hour days and banning dancing in the White House. So what do we make of this sudden surge of poetic vulnerability? Was it guilt? A moment of clarity? Or just a man realizing, too late, that his only real human connection had been quietly holding his life together in the background? Sarah Polk, by the way, outlived him by 42 years. She wore black for all of them. Some might call that devotion, others a long-form performance piece. Either way, love was Polk's last idea. And for a man mostly remembered for annexing land and ignoring fun, it's weird. Weird in a way that suggests something haunting. That maybe his entire life was built around the wrong mission. Maybe he finally realized who the real republic was. But speaking of men who died trying to communicate, sometimes words fail you entirely. And what you're left with is a pencil and a single bone-dry request. For Ulysses S. Grant, writing, water. It's hard to imagine a man who once commanded armies reduced to scribbling a one-word plea. And yet there he was. Ulysses S. Grant, former general, former president, author of his own legacy, hunched over a pad of paper, unable to speak. His throat ravaged by cancer, his voice gone. His command reduced to the barest necessity, water. It's not just the simplicity of the word that sticks. It's the context. This was the man who had dictated terms of surrender at Appomattox, who, with silent resolve, had crushed the Confederacy. A man of grit, of dusty battlefields and cigar smoke, now reduced to a whisper he couldn't make. His final order penciled, not barked. One word, basic, human, and devastating. And sure, it's just water. But that's what makes it worse. It wasn't a political statement. It wasn't a literary flourish. It was a need, a raw, primal one. His last moments weren't spent reliving glories or muttering philosophical musings. They were spent dry-mouthed, dying slowly, silently, trying to soothe a body already letting go. Some historians spin it as symbolic. A soldier's thirst, the body's last rebellion, the spirit asking for one last courtesy. But honestly, maybe it was just that he was thirsty. And he couldn't drink, not even that. Which, if you think about it, is a kind of perfect metaphor for America's most stoic war hero. A man who spent most of his presidency fighting scandals he couldn't control, silences he couldn't break. Still, there's something poetic in the simplicity. A man who had said so much with so little during his life, saying almost nothing at the end. Just a note, a need, and then silence again. And unlike most, Grant didn't just fade away. He was working on his memoirs until the bitter end, penning a legacy for his family to survive on. It sold well. Better than expected. He didn't get to see the profits. But maybe he knew the story would sell. Maybe that one word was his real signature. His final dispatch. From the battlefield to the deathbed, the tone never changed. But not every leader gets to end things with quiet dignity. Some leave behind lines that feel like trial closings, moral conclusions, a last stab at making sense of it all. Like this next guy. A president who got 2 non-consecutive shots at the Oval Office, and apparently died still trying to justify them. 5. Grover Cleveland. I have tried so hard to do right. Ah, the moral desperation of a man in power. Grover Cleveland's last words read like a confession no one asked for. I have tried so hard to do right. Not I did right. Not I stood by my principles. Just tried. The word tried does all the heavy lifting here, doesn't it? It's a strange thing to say at the edge of oblivion. Was he asking for forgiveness? Applause? A do-over? This was the only U.S. president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. A man of contradictions. Staunchly conservative yet reform-minded. Moralizing yet scandal-shadowed. He vetoed more bills than most presidents combined, but he couldn't veto his own mortality. Trying to do right is admirable. Saying it out loud as your final message to the world, however, feels insecure. Or worse, performative. Like an actor whispering his closing line after the play is over, hoping the audience sticks around for a standing ovation. Or maybe it's just honest. Maybe Cleveland, this big, brooding moralist, finally understood the futility of leadership. That doing right in politics is like trying to play chess underwater. Every move gets distorted, every intention drowned, and all you're left with at the end is a whisper that sounds more like a question than a declaration. I have tried so hard to do right. Translation: please tell me it mattered. Please tell me I wasn't just vetoing in vain. Please tell me I didn't just waste my life in procedural warfare. But no reply came. Just the void, and maybe a polite nod from Benjamin Franklin, who centuries earlier had already nailed the art of dying with a smirk. 6. Benjamin Franklin. A dying man can do nothing easy. Now this is a line, dry, sarcastic, perfectly timed. Benjamin Franklin, inventor, writer, printer, diplomat, Enlightenment troll, didn't whimper out of this world. He sighed and rolled his eyes at it. A dying man can do nothing easy, he groaned, after someone told him to shift positions in bed to breathe better. Classic Franklin. Too clever to die with dignity. Too aware of death's absurdity to take it seriously. He didn't reach for God or legacy or confession. He reached for irony. And irony, of course, reached right back. You have to admire a man who makes death sound like an inconvenience. For Franklin, the afterlife wasn't some sacred mystery. It was just another bad day at the office. And you can hear the exhaustion in that line. Not just physical exhaustion, but metaphysical boredom. Like death was just one more thing to deal with. A bureaucratic nuisance. There's also a quiet bite to it. After all, Franklin had spent his whole life doing things the hard way, tinkering, inventing, negotiating, building nations and bifocals. And now, at the very end, even dying wasn't going to cooperate. It's funny, sure, but it's also haunting. Because beneath the sarcasm is a truth everyone secretly knows. Nothing about leaving this world is graceful. And those who pretend otherwise are either lying or selling something. Franklin, as always, did neither. And that's what makes it hit, the way it deflates all the deathbed drama. No grand pronouncement, no spiritual crescendo, just a man, stiff in his sheets, annoyed that even dying is a chore. But not all presidents went out with such wit. Some reviewed the soup. 7. Millard Fillmore. The nourishment is palatable. Some people exit the world with a whisper, some with a bang. Millard Fillmore, 13th President of the United States, left with a Yelp review. The nourishment is palatable. That's it. That was his final contribution to human history. A tepid thumbs up for hospital soup. Not a reflection on life, not a farewell to family, not even a cryptic phrase that historians could chew on for decades. Just a comment on dinner. In fairness, Fillmore was never known for grand gestures. He was the kind of man who kept his shoes polished and his controversies minimal. His presidency was defined by compromises, literally. The Compromise of 1850 was his claim to fame, a desperate attempt to keep the country from splitting in two. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. So maybe it makes sense that his last words were equally non-committal. Palatable. Not good, not satisfying, not even bland, but decent. Just passable, inoffensive, the culinary equivalent of his political legacy. But what really makes this line strange is the context. He was dying. He knew he was dying. And when offered nourishment, something meant to sustain life, to fight back against the tide, his only response was a polite murmur of acceptance. As if death itself was just another course being served, and he was determined not to send it back to the kitchen. You almost want to admire it, the sheer mundanity of it. Fillmore, ever the middle-of-the-road man, refused to make a scene. He reviewed life's final offering like a genteel customer at a subpar inn. There's a kind of sad dignity in that. Or maybe just a stubborn refusal to admit that anything, even death, could shake him out of his usual routine. But then again, maybe he just really liked the soup. And if that was the case, if he truly wanted his last words to be a quiet nod of approval for a final spoonful, then perhaps Millard Fillmore found more satisfaction in that moment than many leaders ever do. Still, not every president went out with table manners. Some died delivering sermons. Some, like the next man, addressed the enslaved people he believed he'd see again, in heaven. 8. Andrew Jackson. I hope to meet each of you in heaven. Be good children, all of you, and strive to be ready when the change comes. There's something deeply unsettling about a man who once signed off on the Trail of Tears using his last breath to invite enslaved people to join him in paradise. Andrew Jackson, war hero, populist icon, 7th president, spent much of his life walking the blurry line between brutality and charisma. He killed men in duels, ignored court rulings, and reshaped the American presidency by sheer force of personality. And at the end, as death crept close, he turned to the people he'd kept in bondage and offered them an afterlife reunion. I hope to meet each of you in heaven, he said. Be good children, all of you, and strive to be ready when the change comes. It sounds sweet, until you read it again, slowly. Be good children. Spoken to adults who had been denied the dignity of autonomy. Strive to be ready, as if the moral burden was on them to earn salvation. Jackson, it seems, was still commanding from the deathbed, still sermonizing, still assuming the paternal role. The benevolent overseer who believed his moral compass pointed true north, even as the rest of the world read it as spinning. It's a fascinating contradiction. The man who destroyed native sovereignty, who benefited from and defended slavery, who believed in white populist power above all else, now casting himself as a kind of spiritual father figure, as if legacy could be rewritten with a single, well-placed phrase. There's a deeper irony here, too. Jackson's theology was always more functional than philosophical. He wielded divine destiny like a sword, a justification for conquest, expansion, and ruthless efficiency. And now, at the end, he wielded it once more, not as a political weapon, but as a comfort blanket. Maybe he believed it. Maybe he genuinely thought they'd all reunite. That his soul, bloodstained as it was, would land in the same heaven as the people he never truly saw as equals. Or maybe, in his own strange way, this was a final act of reconciliation. Tragically tone-deaf, hopelessly inadequate, but sincere. History doesn't usually grant easy redemption, especially not to men like Jackson. And yet here he is, inviting his ghosts to walk with him into the afterlife, unaware they might not want to follow. But if Jackson sermonized his way out, the next guy filibustered, a man whose final breath was basically a political essay, a doomed stand against pneumonia and brevity. 9. William Henry Harrison. Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more. Ah, yes, William Henry Harrison, the man whose presidency was shorter than most modern vacations. He delivered the longest inaugural address in U.S. history, in the freezing rain, without a coat or hat, because obviously appearing tough was more important than basic weatherproofing. A few weeks later, he was dead. Pneumonia. And yes, it's very likely connected to that absurdly long speech. His last words? Not to family, not to friends, but to his doctor. Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more. Which is rich, considering he barely had time to unpack before he died. Still, the line tells us something. Harrison thought his deathbed was still a podium, that even as he slipped out of consciousness, the Republic needed a final nudge. He'd spent 30 days in office, just enough time to set the table, not serve the meal. And it clearly bothered him. There's almost a tragic earnestness to it. Harrison had waited his whole life for this role. He finally got the job. And then death pulled the curtain before Act 1. So he used his last breath to shout through the closing door, "Just stick to the principles!" Of course, which principles? He doesn't say. Jeffersonian? Hamiltonian? His own? Probably didn't matter. The point was to go out sounding like a statesman. Or at least someone who meant well. It's both noble and deeply ironic, because the man who died from talking too much died still talking. And if you thought political guilt was heavy, the next man's final words suggest something even heavier: existential panic. 10. Salmon P. Chase. My God, what have I done? Salmon P. Chase was not a man unaccustomed to responsibility. As Chief Justice of the United States and a former Treasury Secretary under Lincoln, he had his fingerprints all over the blueprint of post-Civil War America. His name was once floated for the presidency. His face even ended up on the $10,000 bill. A wildly impractical denomination, but one that seemed to match his ego. So when a man like that, a man built on ideals, jurisprudence, and careful calculation, spends his last breath exclaiming, "My God, what have I done?" Well, it raises questions. Lots of them. Did he mean a specific decision? A legal ruling? A regret from his political years? Or was it something more visceral, a burst of dread just as consciousness slipped away? The soul's final audit screaming through a failing body? No one knows. And that's what makes it unsettling. This wasn't a slow, reflective confession. It was a burst, sudden, alarmed. Like a man watching the ground disappear beneath him and realizing too late he'd been walking on illusion. Some biographers speculate he was thinking about Reconstruction, about the fragile balance of justice in a country barely stitched back together. Others wonder if it was personal, family tensions, missed opportunities, ambitions that soured. Chase was known for maneuvering politically even while wearing the robes of objectivity. Maybe it caught up to him. But there's also the distinct possibility that this final cry wasn't rational at all. The brain, as it shuts down, often tosses up fragments, fears, echoes, loops. The kind of spontaneous honesty we spend a lifetime trying to suppress. Perhaps, my God, what have I done? Was less about one act, and more about all of them, flooding back at once. Because the weight of a life lived in the public eye, especially one as layered and conflicted as Chase's, doesn't always resolve cleanly, especially not when you're still unsure whether you were the hero or the opportunist in your own story. The silence that followed didn't clarify anything, but it did leave behind a haunting echo. A reminder that even men of principle sometimes die with doubt. And speaking of doubt, confusion and desperate pleas from the edge, the next man didn't exclaim, or whisper, or scribble. He simply disappeared. But first, he gave the world a one-line teaser that still stings with literary mystery. 11. Edgar Allan Poe. Lord help my poor soul. By the time Edgar Allan Poe uttered those words, he was barely recognizable. Disheveled, incoherent, and wearing someone else's clothes, he'd been found wandering the streets of Baltimore, delirious, broken, and babbling. He died 4 days later, slipping in and out of lucidity, unable to explain what had happened to him. Or why. Lord help my poor soul. It's a line soaked in contradiction. The plea of a man who spent most of his life writing about death, madness, and the beautiful futility of it all, now begging for divine mercy. Poe, who had once dismissed traditional piety with literary precision, ended with a trembling appeal to the very force he had so often danced around. And the mystery didn't end with the words. No one knows what killed him. Theories include everything from alcohol poisoning to election day voter fraud schemes. Yes, that was apparently a thing. Others say it was a mugging or a brain tumor or some slow-motion poetic justice handed down by the fates. Whatever it was, it didn't kill his legacy. Poe remains the literary patron saint of beautiful doom. And this last line, it's haunting in a way even he might have appreciated, because it reads like a moment of real, unfiltered despair from a man whose entire career was built on stylized tragedy. It's not a final poem. It's a confession, a break in the mask, a sudden collapse of all the Gothic posturing, leaving behind only a frightened man facing something far less theatrical, the unknowable. Lord, help my poor soul! Short, sharp, unresolvable, like a sentence cut off in the middle of being written, which, in Poe's case, feels appropriate. He was always reaching into the abyss, and maybe, finally, it reached back. And from one tortured literary soul to another, the next man didn't go out with despair. He went out with laughter. No punchline, no setup, just one last, eerie laugh. And then silence. 12. Nathaniel Hawthorne laughed, then died. There's something so uncomfortable, and yet weirdly cinematic, about a man laughing as he dies. Not chuckling politely, not grinning, just laughing, and then stopping, permanently. Nathaniel Hawthorne, author of The Scarlet Letter and America's master of brooding moral fiction, reportedly laughed on his deathbed. No final words, no whispered regret, just laughter. It wasn't a joyful sound, according to those present. It was strange, unexpected, nervous, maybe, but not quite mad. More like knowing. As if Hawthorne, who'd spent his career dissecting the hidden sins of Puritans and the hypocrisy of morality, had finally gotten the joke. And the joke was death, or life. Hard to tell with him. He died in his sleep while traveling with his old friend Franklin Pierce, the former president whose reputation was already fading. The trip was supposed to revive Hawthorne's health. Instead, it turned into a final chapter, one without narration, just laughter, then nothing. We don't know what he was laughing at. No one ever said. It could have been a dream, a hallucination, a private epiphany, or maybe just a last rebellion, mocking death with the only tool a satirist ever truly owns. Hawthorne, who gave us characters buried in guilt, cloaked in secrets, writhing under moral judgment, decided to bow out with none of that. No sermon, no confession, just a laugh in the face of the abyss. And then, poof, curtain closed. It's unnerving, because laughter is usually about relief or irony. And here, it might have been both. The kind of eerie, personal punchline only the dying man could hear. Still, not every writer vanished behind laughter. Some, like the next one, told us exactly what they were about to do, and then simply never came back. 13. Ambrose Bierce. As to me, I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination. Ambrose Bierce, journalist, satirist, and professional misanthrope, was a man who never fully belonged to the world he lived in. Known for the Devil's Dictionary, a lexicon of razor-sharp cynicism where love was a temporary insanity curable by marriage, he had a particular talent for mocking sentiment, optimism, and pretty much anyone who tried to make life sound meaningful. So it's fitting that his final known words read more like a literary riddle than a goodbye. As to me, I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination. He wrote that line in a letter to a friend in 1913. Then he crossed into Mexico during the Revolution and vanished. No body, no witnesses, no explanation. Just one sentence left behind, floating like an epilogue he wrote for himself. There are dozens of theories. Some say he was executed by rebels. Others claim he joined the fight and died in battle. A few believe he staged the whole thing, that it was all performance art, a perfectly curated disappearance by a man who'd spent his life scoffing at closure. But the truth? It's still out there. Or maybe nowhere. And that's the beauty of it. His last words feel rehearsed, but not dishonest. An unknown destination. It's a phrase that reeks of dry detachment, almost smug, as if he knew full well what kind of myth he was leaving in his wake. It's not goodbye. It's not I'm afraid. It's a literary shrug. A man exiting stage left with a tip of the hat and a smoke bomb. And what lingers is that phrase. Unknown destination. A place beyond biography, beyond interpretation. A place even Bierce couldn't satirize. Or maybe he could. Maybe that's exactly what he did. And while he was busy writing his own vanishing act, someone else, a man who lived in the spotlight but died whispering, was calling for the one person who defined his earliest years and perhaps his only real softness. 14. Truman Capote. Mama, Mama, Mama. The man who once said, "Love is a chain of love as nature is a chain of life," ended not with a clever quote or scathing wit, but with a cry so childlike it cuts right through the cultivated eccentricity. Mama, Mama, Mama. Truman Capote, the sharp-tongued literary darling behind In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's, was famous for his brilliance and infamous for his self-destruction. He wore flamboyance like armor, dished gossip like gospel, and seemed to live in a state of constant contradiction, part genius, part spectacle. But death has a way of stripping off the costume. There, in his final hours, Capote wasn't the high society misfit or the literary provocateur. He was just a man calling out for the woman who shaped him, haunted him, and abandoned him in equal measure. His relationship with his mother, Lily May, later known as Nina, was fraught. A toxic blend of dependence and neglect. She'd left him as a child, chasing glamour, and he never fully recovered. Her presence loomed over him in every social performance, every book, every carefully sharpened insult disguised as charm. So when he called for her, not once but 3 times, it wasn't just nostalgia. It was regression. A full collapse into the most primal version of himself. A boy in pain, a soul searching for its first shelter. There's no irony in it, no clever twist, just a devastating stillness. And maybe that's what makes it so haunting. Capote, who'd lived in artifice, died in sincerity, not reaching for fame or salvation or legacy, just for Mama. But not everyone slipped into sincerity. The next man went out the only way he knew how, staging the final act like a punchline, turning even death into a trip, the kind that starts weird and ends somewhere off screen. 15. Hunter S. Thompson. Relax, this won't hurt. It sounds like a joke. It sounds like something you'd say before pulling a prank, or maybe giving someone a questionable tattoo at 3 a.m. But no, it was written, purposeful, final. A message for those left behind. Relax, this won't hurt. Hunter S. Thompson, the godfather of gonzo journalism, never did things the usual way. He covered politics like a hallucination, described reality like it owed him money, and approached life with the attitude of a man who'd already been thrown out of every decent establishment and was working his way through the bad ones. He called Richard Nixon a crook long before it was fashionable. He shot his typewriter when it displeased him. He kept a peacock on his property for aesthetic reasons. He was a myth made flesh. And yet, his last words weren't about rebellion. They weren't about politics. They weren't even about legacy. They were about reassurance. Relax. This won't hurt. There's something darkly tender in that. Like he wanted to soften the blow. Not for himself, but for those who had to keep reading the story after he closed the book. And yes, it feels like a lie, because it did hurt. That's the irony. The kind of irony Thompson would have appreciated. His words promised peace, but left chaos. Friends devastated, readers stunned. A legacy immortalized not in comfort, but in contradiction. But that's the beauty of Thompson's final note. It contains all the contradictions he embodied. The coolness, the deflection, the theatricality. And under it all, a glimmer of real feeling. Because when you spend your whole life exaggerating reality, the hardest truth is always the smallest one. It ends, the trip ends, the story ends. And all you can offer, if you're lucky, is a little warning, a whisper, a wink, a half-hearted comfort. Relax, this won't hurt. But the next woman knew better. Her final words sounded like a line from her own poetry, strange, beautiful, and quietly terrifying. 16. Emily Dickinson. I must go in, for the fog is rising. Leave it to Emily Dickinson to deliver a final line that reads like it was plucked straight from the final stanza of her own myth. I must go in, for the fog is rising. Not goodbye, not help, not even a request, just observation, poetry, ominous, detached, and quietly cosmic. A sentence that floats, like fog, just above full comprehension. Dickinson had always treated life like a room she never quite wanted to leave. She spent most of her adult years holed up in her family home in Amherst, Massachusetts, rarely leaving her property, rarely accepting visitors. She baked, she wrote, she watched. Her letters often read like riddles, her poems like hauntings with punctuation, and yet, at the end, she didn't fade into incoherence. She narrated her own departure, as if death, for her, wasn't a rupture, just a change in the weather. The fog is rising. It's subtle, and that's what makes it disturbing. Fog doesn't scream. It doesn't announce itself. It just creeps in, quiet and silver, softening everything into obscurity. For Dickinson, who wrote obsessively about death, bees, immortality, and afternoon light, this fog may have been both metaphor and manifestation. Did she mean the literal fog of dusk? The way her vision blurred? The veil between this world and the next? Maybe all of it. Maybe none. That's the brilliance. She didn't say, I'm dying. She said, I must go in. As if the party was ending. As if she'd had her fill. As if the house, her eternal house, was calling her back inside. And outside? Just fog. Just the great, unknowable blur. She lived her life in controlled quiet. She left the same way. But not everyone made death feel so composed. The next voice you'll hear? A grumble, not a whisper. A man fumbling for his glasses, reaching toward a future he wouldn't see. 17. Mark Twain. Give me my glasses. The man who made America laugh and squirm, with tales of mischievous boys, riverboats, and biting satire, ended his journey with a line that sounds, well, disappointingly practical. Give me my glasses. Not exactly a deathbed quote for the ages. Unless, of course, you've ever read Twain, and you realize that practicality was often the shell around his genius. He said this while reaching for something that wasn't there. His glasses. Possibly not even on the table, possibly already in someone's hand. The point wasn't vision, it was habit. Twain, who spent decades peering through wire-rimmed lenses at the absurdity of American life, was still trying to focus, still trying to see. But maybe this wasn't a mistake. Maybe this was the final punchline. After a life spent skewering pomposity, hypocrisy, and human folly, Twain didn't go out quoting scripture or offering a sentimental farewell. He went out like a man still trying to read, still searching for clarity, still a little bit annoyed. And of course, it's poetic too, because eyesight, and the failure of it, was always in his stories, from Huck's squinting naivete to the blind spots of American morality. Twain saw things clearly when others refused to. But now, here at the end, he couldn't. Not quite. The world was slipping away. The fog, as Dickinson would say, was rising. So he reached for his glasses, as if they could help him understand what was coming next, as if the last page still needed editing, as if he wasn't quite done being Mark Twain. And that's the tragedy and comedy of it. A man whose words shaped the nation's conscience, left asking for lenses. But if Twain misread his own ending, the next man outright miscalculated his mission. He thought he had more time. He believed he was chosen. What he got instead was a cruel little twist of fate. And a bottle cap. 18. Tennessee Williams. God will protect me. I have a mission. Tennessee Williams, playwright of Loneliness and Longing, architect of Blanche DuBois and Brick Paulette, lived in the melodrama. His characters teetered on the edge of despair and illusion, and so did he. His last words? God will protect me. I have a mission. It's a line that belongs in one of his plays. A declaration made by a trembling character in a hot room, drenched in sweat and delusion. And yet these weren't lines from a script. They were real, spoken with conviction, with belief, maybe even with fear. Williams had always been surrounded by chaos, familial, emotional, chemical, and through it all he held on to the idea that he was here for something bigger, a purpose, a calling, art, suffering, beauty, whatever you want to call it. And so, when death came knocking, he did what any of his characters would do. He shouted it down. He said, "No, not now. I'm not done. I have a mission. It's theatrical." But not fake. He believed it. That's what makes it hurt. Because unlike his carefully constructed dramas, this ending wasn't rehearsed. There was no Act 3 redemption. No final soliloquy delivered to thunderous applause. Just a sudden, abrupt exit. His words linger, though. Not just for what they meant to him, but for what they reveal to us. That belief in purpose doesn't always protect you. That feeling chosen doesn't always mean you're spared. Sometimes the curtain falls anyway, whether you finish the mission or not. And that's the cruel joke of it all. But if Williams believed in missions, the next man believed in transitions, shifts, the kind that don't ask for permission, only surrender. 19. Walt Whitman. Shift, shift. It's hard to tell whether Walt Whitman's final words were a request, a command, or a metaphor so potent it accidentally became poetry. Shift, shift. It could have been nothing more than a bedside instruction, the kind of thing one murmurs when they can't get comfortable. Move me, turn me, help me breathe. But when Walt Whitman says it, it can't just be about posture, can it? This is the man who wrote Leaves of Grass, who described the soul like a song and the body like a battlefield. The man who turned American dirt into scripture, who walked with wounded soldiers and believed death was just another form of motion. Shift, shift. It's vague enough to feel like a glitch, like the brain looping, fading, searching for rhythm. But it's also deeply Whitman. Movement as meaning, change as constant. He didn't say, "I'm dying." He said, "Shift," as if the transition from life to death wasn't a fall, but a pivot, a realignment, a passing into the next field, the next whisper, the next breathless version of being. It's possible he wasn't trying to say anything profound. His body was failing, his mind fogging, and yet, the words he left behind invite interpretation because he invited interpretation. That was Whitman's whole project. Make the mundane cosmic. Let the reader complete the verse. So maybe he was asking the nurse to move him, or maybe he was addressing the universe. One last instruction to the cosmos. Shift. Change me. Move me. Take me forward. And once the shift happened, there was no turning back. He went, like a tide pulling away from the shore he had spent a lifetime romanticizing. But if Whitman whispered his exit through symbolism, the next man did it through contradiction. A final gasp split between grace and damnation. 20. James Thurber, God bless. God damn. There's something fitting about James Thurber. Cartoonist, satirist, and master of gentle absurdity, going out with a line that sounds like a tug-of-war between redemption and resignation. God bless, God damn. 2 phrases, one after the other, one hopeful, one furious. Neither clarified. Together they feel like a moral coin toss, a closing argument with no conclusion. Thurber spent his life poking fun at American culture. Middle-class manners, gender roles, modern life, all filtered through squiggly drawings and droll narratives. He understood the human condition not through tragedy, but through irony. His wit was quiet, observant, and weirdly tender. He didn't scold the world, he sighed at it. So it makes sense that his last breath would be conflicted, that he couldn't decide whether to offer a benediction or a curse. Maybe he meant to say one and accidentally said the other. Or maybe, and this is more likely, he meant both. Because that's the human condition, isn't it? Caught between blessing and blame. Between awe and exasperation. Between thank you and what was that? God bless. God damn. It's the final punctuation mark of a man who lived in the middle, where most of us do. It's also strangely democratic. You get the sacred and the profane, the grace and the grumble. No clear winner. And it's deeply Thurber to leave behind a line that no theologian can fully claim. A joke, a confession, a complaint, a prayer. But if Thurber's last words were a seesaw of belief and bitterness, the next man's were a spark, a glimpse into something just out of reach, electric, inexplicable, and still not understood. 21. Steve Jobs. Oh wow. Oh wow, oh wow, reported by his sister, repeated 3 times, spoken with wonder. Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow. No explanation, no follow-up, just awe. And then silence. Steve Jobs, the architect of modern desire, the man who turned aluminum and glass into objects of devotion, didn't leave us a roadmap or a mission statement. He didn't tell us to stay hungry again. He just said, wow. It's weirdly childlike, almost innocent, like someone seeing something they'd forgotten existed, like someone glimpsing the backstage of reality and being genuinely impressed. His sister Mona Simpson wrote about it. She said his tone was filled with wonder, not fear, not confusion, but wonder. And that's the part that lingers. Because for all his ruthlessness, his famous temper, his perfectionism, Jobs was, at his core, someone obsessed with beauty, with experience, with the reveal. He treated product launches like religious ceremonies. He believed design could be sacred. So maybe, at the very end, he got his own reveal. The final keynote, the ultimate unboxing. Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow. 3 beats. Like a final product demo with no audience, or maybe with one very strange silent one. Of course, we don't know what he saw. We're not meant to. That's the unsettling part. The part that reminds us that even the most powerful tech visionary can't code his way past the end. But maybe, just maybe, he saw something real. Or maybe the brain, as it dies, produces fireworks, neural finales, a hallucination of light. Either way, Jobs didn't say goodbye. He didn't say help. He said, wow. Which, let's be honest, is a better review than palatable. 22. Benjamin Spock. We're all dying. That's what you need to know. Leave it to Dr. Spock, not the Vulcan, but the pediatrician who revolutionized American parenting, to deliver a final line that feels like it should have come stapled to every crib. We're all dying. That's what you need to know. This wasn't whispered in fear or shouted in protest. It was spoken with clarity, as if he were dictating instructions on how to swaddle a newborn. In a way, that's what he'd spent his life doing. Not swaddling literal babies forever, though, yes, he helped with that, but guiding parents on how to raise them with trust, empathy, and yes, a clear-eyed understanding that nothing lasts. Dr. Spock was a calm revolutionary. His 1946 book, The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, sold more copies than almost anything not titled the Bible. He told a post-war generation that babies weren't just tiny soldiers in training. They were people. Emotional, vulnerable, deserving of affection. A shocking idea, apparently. And now here he was, on his own deathbed, giving one last piece of advice. The kind of cosmic, grim wisdom that could be read as despair, or as perspective. We're all dying. A fact, a reminder, a grounding. The kind of thing you say not to frighten someone, but to get them to stop arguing and look you in the eye. That's what you need to know. Not optional, not anecdotal, need. There's no panic in it, no plea. Just that sterile calm that defined his voice. Even in the final moments, Spock was teaching. But what was the lesson, really? That death is universal? That there's no escaping it? Maybe. Or maybe he was just trying to demystify it the way he had demystified everything else. From tantrums to adolescence. It's the final diagnosis. The final bedtime story. The same man who told mothers not to worry so much now telling the rest of us the same thing. We're all dying, so act accordingly. And if that lands too heavily, don't worry. The next man up made dying sound like a boring chore. 23. Richard Feynman. I'd hate to die twice. It's so boring. Richard Feynman was one of the sharpest minds of the 20th century. A physicist who helped develop quantum electrodynamics, who played the bongo drums for fun, and who approached life like it was one big curiosity experiment. So, of course, his last words weren't solemn. They were snark. I'd hate to die twice. It's so boring. This wasn't an insult to death. It was an insult to repetition. Feynman was allergic to routine. He couldn't sit through a bad lecture, let alone the end of his own life without commentary. Death for him wasn't frightening. It was just uninteresting. A bad finale. No new data. Nothing to measure. This was a man who once broke into the lockers at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project just to see if he could. Who explained quantum physics with childlike metaphors and Manhattan diner analogies. For Feynman, life was only worth living if you could learn from it. And death? Well, once you've been through it, what's left to observe? I'd hate to die twice. Not because of the pain, because of the redundancy, the inefficiency. That's the punchline. Feynman's entire career was about surprise, finding joy in the unexplained, beauty in the patterns. Dying in his mind was an unsolvable loop, an endpoint with no whiteboard, and if there's one thing he hated more than false certainty, it was boredom. So he made sure his last words weren't boring, or rather, he made them about how boring dying was, which, somehow, makes it funny. But not everyone greets death with smirking sarcasm. Some, like the next man, look into the beyond and say what no one else can confirm. A vision, a statement, a metaphor, or just the flicker of a fading mind lit up one final time. 24. Thomas Edison. It is very beautiful over there. Of all the people you'd expect to treat death like a light switch, it would be Thomas Edison. Inventor of the modern world, man of wires and filaments, patents and prototypes, the guy who lit the planet one bulb at a time. So what do you say when that guy looks past you in his final moments and says, with clear eyes and calm voice, "It is very beautiful over there"? He didn't say what there was, didn't elaborate, didn't describe streets of gold or loved ones waiting or angels with wings. He just said it was beautiful. And maybe that's enough. Because Edison, for all his pragmatism, wasn't without awe. He was a tireless tinkerer, but also a man who believed in possibility, who understood that even a light bulb, once a fantasy, could change the way humanity lived, dreamed, worked. So when he talked about beauty, he probably meant it in the truest possible sense, something beyond explanation, but instantly recognizable. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't even say, I'm going. He reported, as if he had just opened a door, peeked through, and turned back to let us know what he saw. And what he saw was beautiful. There's something comforting about that. Not saccharine, not forced. Just a final observation from a man who spent his life showing us what could be done with darkness, and how it could always be turned to light. And then, he was gone. No flash, no bang, just a soft click, like a switch flipped somewhere we can't yet see. 25. Jonas Salk. I have had dreams and I've had nightmares. I overcame the nightmares because of my dreams. If Thomas Edison illuminated the world with electricity, Jonas Salk lit it up with hope, and his final words sound exactly like that, a statement soaked in clarity, a scientist's last hypothesis rendered in poetry. I have had dreams and I've had nightmares. I overcame the nightmares because of my dreams. It reads like a line rehearsed, but not in vanity, in purpose. Because Salk's entire life was an exercise in steady courage. The man who refused to patent the polio vaccine, famously saying, "Could you patent the sun?" had built his legacy on the radical notion that science was not property. It was promise. And so his final statement lands like a thesis, a summary of his philosophy. Yes, life brings nightmares, disease, fear, despair. But it also brings dreams, and sometimes the only way through the first is to hold on to the second. Salk's words blur the boundary between science and soul. They're not the cool, clinical observations of a lab coat, but the wisdom of someone who's seen both the chaos of the microscope and the quiet of mortality. He understood that the two aren't enemies. They're just phases. Night and day, nightmare and dream. He didn't deny the darkness. He just refused to let it be the ending. And it's remarkable, really, that a man who spent his life dealing in data, trials, and results would go out speaking in metaphors. Maybe he'd finally learned that the most universal truths can't be graphed. They can only be felt. Salk's last words could be engraved on the door of any laboratory. Hope is not irrational. It's survival. He didn't just cure a disease. He articulated a worldview, one that made science feel human again. And after him came another scientist, one who lived closer to the edge of destruction, the man who looked upon the birth of a weapon and saw the face of something divine and horrifying. 26. J. Robert Oppenheimer. I am become death. He said it years before his actual death, but it became, in the public imagination, his epitaph. I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. The words that slipped out of him as the first atomic bomb bloomed over the desert at Trinity. And while they weren't technically his last spoken words on Earth, they might as well have been. Because nothing he said afterward, not his lectures, not his apologies, ever escaped the shadow of that sentence. By the time he reached his final days, Oppenheimer was a ghost in his own reputation. Frail, brilliant, haunted. The quote had become shorthand for guilt, for hubris, for mankind's sudden realization that it had outsmarted itself. He borrowed the phrase from the Bhagavad Gita, where the god Vishnu reveals his true form, infinite, terrible, divine, to a human being trembling at the edge of understanding. And Oppenheimer, with his austere voice and sunken eyes, carried that same tremor into history. I am become death. It's a confession disguised as enlightenment, a line so ancient it feels inevitable and yet so modern it still echoes. Because Oppenheimer didn't just describe destruction. He personalized it. He became it. When he finally died years later, that line was waiting for him like a shadow that never left his side. It's strange how sometimes the words we speak in awe become the ones that define our remorse. But where Oppenheimer's final act was a lament, the next man's was devotion, to love, to companionship, to the idea that life was a shared project, right up to the end. 27. Buckminster Fuller. She's gone. I'm going too. They called him Bucky, architect, inventor, philosopher, the man who gave us the geodesic dome and the belief that humanity could engineer its way into harmony. But in his final hours, Buckminster Fuller wasn't thinking about domes or blueprints or utopias. He was thinking about his wife. She had fallen ill. They'd been together more than 60 years, a lifetime of eccentricities, experiments, and shared obsessions. When she slipped away quietly, Fuller turned to those around him and said, "She's gone. I'm going too." And then he did. Not days later, hours. As if the simple act of her absence unthreaded him from existence. For a man whose career was built on systems thinking, on understanding the invisible structures that hold the world together, his final gesture was perfectly on brand. He had discovered the equation he couldn't live without. She's gone. I'm going too. It's not grief. It's synchronization, a statement of natural law, a closing of a circuit. And yet, beneath the scientific neatness, there's tenderness. The man who designed the future died following the only constant that ever made sense to him. Love as geometry. Connection as energy. It's one of those endings that feels less like tragedy and more like balance. Two lives intertwined so tightly that when one signal ceased, the other flickered out in response. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the hum of his logic echoing in that final breath. Not despair, not defiance, but design. She's gone. I'm going too. And with that, the engineer of patterns became part of the pattern itself. 28. Carl Sagan. There is no doubt. There is no doubt. When Carl Sagan spoke, the universe listened. Or at least millions of earthbound viewers did, tuning in as he explained galaxies, atoms, evolution, and everything in between with that unmistakable voice, soft, deliberate, as if each word had been marinated in stardust. His mantra was clarity, skepticism, and wonder. And so, it's ironic, and oddly perfect, that his final words were a phrase that sounds like reassurance, but lands like a question caught in an echo chamber. There is no doubt. There is no doubt. Repeated twice, then silence. It sounds definitive, sure, but the repetition makes it strange. It could have been confidence, or confusion. Certainty slipping into uncertainty. A scientist's mind looping in its final moments, holding tight to conviction while his body loosened its grip. But what was there no doubt about? Life after death? The end itself? The people he loved? Or just the strange sensation of dissolving into the very cosmos he'd spent a career describing? We'll never know. Which, of course, is what Sagan would have wanted us to admit. He loved the idea of the known brushing up against the unknown, of staring into the pale blue dot and realizing how little and how much we matter. And yet, here at the end, the man who taught us to ask big questions died delivering a statement, a declaration, not of data, but of emotion. There is no doubt. The line vibrates with both peace and ambiguity. Sagan, ever the cosmic poet, knew that real science doesn't end in perfect clarity. It ends in awe. So maybe his last words weren't meant to be an answer, but an affirmation of belief. Belief in reason, in wonder, in the idea that the universe, for all its chaos, might still make sense. Or maybe, just maybe, it doesn't. And he was trying to convince himself of that. But if Sagan's final moment was filled with quiet conviction, the next one was drenched in resignation. A Nobel Prize winner who, when staring into the void, chose to shrug. 29. Albert A. Michelson. I suppose we'll all have to go sometime. Michelson was a man of light, literally. He measured it, calculated it, defined its speed with such precision that Einstein later used his results to reshape physics entirely. And when his own light began to fade, he didn't wax poetic. He didn't look for metaphors. He simply said, I suppose we'll all have to go sometime. Dry, flat, unemotional, but not hollow. There's a strange kind of comfort in the line, a practical resignation from a man who'd spent his life studying the immutable rules of nature. Birth, decay, entropy, all predictable, all inevitable, no drama, no cosmic longing, just a final shrug from someone who accepted the equation. In another life, perhaps he would have added QED, because that's what this sounds like. A conclusion, a summing up. Death as part of the formula, not a disruption of it. Unlike Sagan, who danced with the stars, Michelson just punched in the last number and let the answer stand. And maybe that's okay. Not everyone needs to go out wondering. Some people go out confirming. But then there are those who, even in their final breath, decide to teach. To offer not an answer, but a strange and haunting piece of philosophy, a farewell that feels like a koan whispered into the wind. 30. William James. I have no recollection of my birth and no fear of my death. William James, the father of American psychology and pragmatism, left behind a legacy built on curiosity and introspection. And when it came time to face the ultimate unknown, he didn't flinch. He framed it. I have no recollection of my birth and no fear of my death. It's the kind of thing you'd expect from a philosopher. Neat, balanced, deeply symmetrical. Birth and death, bookends to the same unknowable process. One forgotten, one yet to unfold, neither under our control. There's a boldness in it, a calmness, the kind that only comes from a life spent thinking deeply about everything. James had long believed that consciousness was more than brain chemistry, that it had purpose, direction, maybe even meaning. But he was also a scientist, and he knew that not everything could be proven. That belief was often a matter of will. That peace was often a choice. So he chose it. No fear. Not because he was brave, because fear to him was irrational. A misfiring of the same neural machinery that couldn't remember the beginning and couldn't predict the end. What's beautiful, and slightly unnerving, about the line is how personal it feels. Not we have no recollection. I don't. Not there is no fear. I don't have fear. It's a deeply individual acknowledgement. A man standing on the shoreline of the infinite and saying, essentially, I've been here before. I just don't remember it. It's oddly comforting. And a little spooky. Because if we really don't remember the beginning, then maybe we've already survived the worst part. Maybe death is just the second part of the sentence. Or maybe it's just another experiment, the final variable in a life lived under the microscope of thought. Either way, James met it not with bravado, not with surrender, but with balance. And for a man obsessed with the inner workings of the human mind, that might be the most fitting goodbye of all. 31. Frank Sinatra. I'm losing it. Frank Sinatra, the man whose voice once seemed to hold the universe together with a single sustained note, exited the stage with a line that wasn't melodic or poetic or even rehearsed. It was abrupt, honest, unfiltered. I'm losing it. Not exactly what you'd expect from the chairman of the board. But then again, Sinatra had always lived in tension, between confidence and collapse, swagger and solitude. He gave the world songs that sounded like swaggering declarations of love, regret, and vaguest-tinted bravado. And yet, here at the end, he wasn't singing. He wasn't crooning. He was confessing. There's no artifice in those words, no final performance. Just a man realizing, maybe for the first time in his life, that control had finally slipped beyond reach. For someone like Sinatra, who famously directed everything from the orchestra to the lighting to the temperature in the room, those 3 words hit like an aria in reverse. I'm losing it. What's it? Consciousness? Clarity? Dignity? Life? All of the above? It doesn't matter. The line lands like a spotlight dimming in real time, and yet it's a kind of reluctant grace. Sinatra, even in decline, wasn't interested in poeticizing the inevitable. He didn't try to stage his death like a scene in From Here to Eternity. He just said what was happening, and then he let go. There's something strangely fitting about it. Sinatra spent decades pretending not to care what people thought, but of course he cared deeply. He was meticulous, image-obsessed. So maybe his last great act was to drop the act, to say something raw, to acknowledge the fade-out without trying to style it. He had flown us to the moon, but in the end, he just wanted to stay grounded long enough to speak the truth. But if Sinatra left with a murmur of self-awareness, the next man left with a plan, or at least an errand, a final routine that turned out to be permanent. 32. Elvis Presley. I'm going to the bathroom to read. It sounds mundane, forgettable even. I'm going to the bathroom to read. And yet, those were the final words of Elvis Presley. The king, the icon, the voice that rewired American music. The line is so absurdly ordinary that it loops back around to being profound. For all the glitter, for all the jumpsuits, the stadiums, the screaming fans, the legend. This is how the curtain began to fall. Not with fanfare, not with a farewell tour, with a casual declaration about a bathroom break and some reading material. There's no symbolism, no hidden meaning. Unless, of course, you think about how Elvis had spent years living in a gold-plated cage of his own myth. He was a man haunted by what he used to be, by what people expected him to remain. And in that final moment, he wasn't trying to be anything but a guy looking for a little privacy and a distraction. He was, perhaps for the first time in a long time, just being human. And maybe that's the point. Maybe that's the strange poetry of it, that no matter how many arenas you sell out, or how many times your hips scandalize a nation, you still go out doing the same little things everyone else does. It's ironic, though. The man who electrified the stage with raw energy and physicality chose, consciously or not, to bow out in absolute stillness. And yet, even now, fans talk about Elvis as if he might still be out there, in disguise, sipping coffee in Memphis, waiting for his second act. But the final line remains. A sentence so ordinary, it feels sacred. And speaking of icons who lived larger than life but died in unsettling intimacy, the next voice came from a man of the frontier, the mythic West, the Marlboro masculinity repackaged into patriotism. And even he, in the end, found himself clinging to the simplest form of love. 33. John Wayne. Of course I know who you are. You're my girl. I love you. The Duke, the cowboy, the embodiment of American grit. John Wayne died not with a growl or a gunslinging gesture, but with something much quieter, much softer. Of course I know who you are. You're my girl. I love you. It was said to his wife, but it sounds like it was said to time itself, to memory, to a face half lost in the haze of illness and pain. There's a desperate warmth in that line, a man trying to reassure someone else, maybe even reassure himself. The kind of moment where ego drops, the hat comes off, and the gunslinger becomes the man underneath. John Wayne had spent his life constructing a persona, tough, stoic, bulletproof. He played characters who never doubted, never faltered, never softened. And yet, his final words were not about strength. They were about recognition, connection. Of course I know who you are. That line alone cuts deep, because it suggests there had been doubt. That maybe for a moment he didn't know. That the man who had always known exactly what to say, even if it was scripted, was suddenly uncertain. And that realization was terrifying enough that he needed to speak into it, to name love before it faded. And then, "You're my girl. I love you." No drawl, no swagger, just truth. It's almost hard to reconcile. The towering figure of Wayne, a cultural monolith, reduced in his last breath to something painfully human. Not commanding a battlefield, not wrangling a wild horse, not defending manifest destiny, just holding on to one person in the room. And maybe that's the most American thing of all, pretending you're invincible until the very end, and then proving that you're not. 34. Marilyn Monroe. Say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to the president, and say goodbye to yourself because you're a nice guy. No one really knows what Marilyn Monroe meant when she said this. That's fitting, because no one really knew Marilyn Monroe. Say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to the president, and say goodbye to yourself because you're a nice guy. It's a sentence that sounds like a maze. A layered farewell, delivered over the phone to her friend Peter Lawford, just hours before her death. A strange goodbye to three people at once, one of whom was on the call, one of whom was the President of the United States, and one of whom apparently was herself. If you're trying to untangle this line, you're not alone. Historians have been squinting at it for decades. Was it sincere? Was it code? Was it resignation, sarcasm, or just confusion? Here's the thing about Marilyn. She wasn't just a person, she was a projection. A character built from curves and candlelight. And like any character, the real story was written in the margins. This final message, it's all margins. Say goodbye to Pat. That's Pat Lawford, Peter's wife, JFK's sister, part of the gilded circle Monroe occasionally orbited. Say goodbye to the president. That would be JFK. Whispers, rumors, and entire conspiracy ecosystems have been built on that one fragment of the sentence. But then comes the most unsettling part. Say goodbye to yourself because you're a nice guy. What does that mean? Was it a farewell? A warning? A performance? You can hear the echo of someone unraveling, but also someone very aware of how to leave an impression. Marilyn knew how words worked. She knew how she worked, or at least how others wanted her to. This isn't a straightforward goodbye. It's a monologue, a fade-out, a final scene, improvised on a private stage. And like everything else about Marilyn, it ends in mystery. Not with clarity, not with closure, just with the kind of ambiguity that invites speculation forever. And while she left the stage quietly, the next voice followed a similar script, soft, ordinary, and laced with an eerie finality. But instead of politics, this one involved something much more domestic, a bath. 35. Whitney Houston. I'm going to go take a bath. Of all the ways to exit a conversation, I'm going to go take a bath might be the most unremarkable. It's the kind of line that could come from any tired person, in any city, at the end of any long day. But when Whitney Houston said it, it turned into something else. Something heavy. Something cinematic in its banality. It's haunting precisely because it's so mundane. Whitney Houston was one of the most powerful vocalists in history. Her voice rang like a cathedral bell, unshakable and divine. But by the end of her life, the fame, the pressure, the endless public scrutiny had turned that voice into a whisper. I'm gonna go take a bath. It doesn't sound like a last line. It sounds like an intermission, a break, a moment of escape. But that's the tragic twist. It was the end. The curtain closed before the next line could be spoken. There's something chilling about how ordinary it was. It wasn't a dramatic confession. It wasn't a swan song. It was just a sentence, spoken with the expectation of return. You imagine Whitney, perhaps exhausted, perhaps hoping for a moment of peace, the kind of peace the world never really gave her. She was adored, but dissected, idolized, but invaded, and in the end, it seems, she just wanted quiet. And if we read her last words as literal, then it was a simple act of self-care, a pause, a retreat. But if we read between the lines, and we always do, then maybe we hear someone seeking more than just a bath. Maybe we hear someone trying to wash something off, to reset, to disappear, if only for a while. She didn't announce an ending. She excused herself. And speaking of exits that arrived too soon, the next man didn't even mean to say goodbye. He just wanted to drive. But sometimes, the invitation is the ending. 36. Paul Walker. Hey, let's go for a drive. There are few last words more tragically ironic than this. Hey, let's go for a drive. Paul Walker, known to millions as Brian O'Connor from the Fast and the Furious franchise, lived a double life. On screen, he was the car guy. Off screen, he really was the car guy. Fast cars weren't a prop. They were a passion. So it makes sense that his final invitation was a drive. It wasn't ominous. It was familiar. Let's go for a drive. Casual. Innocent. The beginning of something, not the end. And that's what makes it so strange. We're used to dramatic farewells or poetic goodbyes. But this was just a suggestion, an impulse, the kind of phrase friends toss to each other without thinking. What's tragic is how normal it was. He wasn't running from anything. He wasn't lost in despair. He was just doing what he loved in a moment that felt, to everyone involved, like any other day. There's a unique kind of heartbreak in that, because there's no way to know it was the last thing he'd say. There was no crescendo, no setup, just a guy inviting another guy to go for a drive. It's the ultimate casual exit, a sentence that would have been forgotten if not for what followed. And so it remains, frozen, a perfect loop of irony. The star of a franchise about living fast, gone in a moment that felt ordinary. It reminds us that endings don't always come with warning signs. Sometimes they arrive mid-sentence, mid-plan, mid-drive, and the only thing left is the echo of an invitation no one ever expected to be final. 37. Heath Ledger. Katie, look. It'll be fine, you know. I just need to sleep. There's something so chillingly human in these final words. Katie, look. It'll be fine, you know. I just need to sleep. Spoken to his sister over the phone just hours before the end, Heath Ledger wasn't speaking like a man nearing a final curtain. He wasn't composing a swan song or saying his goodbyes. He was tired, reassuring, casual. That's what makes it hurt. Because Ledger wasn't a man clinging to drama. He was trying to avoid it. He wasn't aware his last lines were going to be etched into the memory of pop culture and grief. He just needed rest. Just need to sleep. It's a phrase we've all said, after long days, after longer weeks. But coming from someone who had been in the eye of a global storm, playing roles that burrowed under the skin, haunting fans and friends alike, the line lands with eerie resonance. Heath Ledger had just finished filming The Dark Knight, where his portrayal of the Joker redefined madness for a new generation. It was a performance so intense, so consuming, that people still argue over how much of him was left when the makeup came off. But in that final phone call, there was no Joker, no darkness. Just Heath, calling his sister Katie, like a younger brother trying to calm her down. It'll be fine. He said it like someone who believed it. Not a last breath. More like a postponement. A rain check on worry. There's no poetry in it, no cosmic hint. That's what makes it honest. He didn't deliver his own tragedy. He walked into it like it was any other Tuesday. And that's the line that lingers. I just need to sleep. Because whether you're a film icon or just another tired soul, sometimes sleep sounds like the solution. Sometimes it's all you want. And then it's all you get. But not everyone fades gently. Some people, like the next man, depart mid-sentence, with no audience, and a line that sounds like it could have been written on the side of a soup can. 38. Andy Warhol. Gee, I say that's very interesting. Andy Warhol's last words feel like a shrug wrapped in quotation marks. Gee, I say that's very interesting. Reportedly spoken to no one in particular, maybe to a nurse, maybe to a wall, maybe to the air. Warhol died the way he lived, observing. His whole life was commentary. Not loud, not even always coherent, but constant. He once said, "I am a deeply superficial person," and spent his career turning that contradiction into an art form. So what's so interesting about the moment of death? Maybe it was the machines around him, the sounds of the hospital, the look on someone's face. Or maybe it was death itself, slipping in quietly, unannounced, like a party crasher at one of his famous factory gatherings. Warhol had always been obsessed with surfaces, with repetition, with things that looked like meaning, but might not be. So of course he'd treat death not as a tragedy, but as a curiosity. Gee, I say that's very interesting. It's almost too perfect. A line that could have come from one of his soup cans or silkscreens, vague enough to apply to anything, specific enough to feel like it meant something, which of course is exactly the tightrope he walked for decades. Some say it was a meaningless comment. Others think he was having some final insight. But the truth? The truth is that he probably did think it was interesting. He thought everything was interesting. He built a movement out of observation, and then left it mid-comment. No grand gesture, no parting message, just one last reaction, suspended in the air like one of his helium-filled balloons. And from there, we fall straight into irony. The next man was known for mocking death, defying reverence, and treating the end like a running joke. So of course, when he said he was perfectly fine, he wasn't. 39. George Carlin. I'm perfectly fine. The final words of George Carlin weren't screamed, joked, or carved into a wall. They were spoken with casual dismissal just 5 minutes before he died. I'm perfectly fine. Spoiler, he was not. Carlin made a career out of poking the universe in the eye. His routines were brutal, brilliant dissections of American life, politics, religion, and the daily absurdities we all agreed to live with. He didn't believe in euphemism. He didn't believe in comfort. He believed in saying what everyone else was afraid to say, and making you laugh at it. So when he said, "I'm perfectly fine," was it denial, deadpan, a bit? Maybe all three. It's a phrase you use to end a conversation, to assure someone they don't need to worry, to dodge further questions. But in Carlin's mouth, even that simple phrase carries sarcasm. You can almost hear the eye roll. The man who once said, "Death is caused by swallowing small amounts of saliva over a long period of time," couldn't have planned a more ironically timed exit. What makes the line so potent is its normalcy. He wasn't on stage. He wasn't performing. He was just talking. And still, the irony stuck the landing. There's something poetically Carlin about that. A man who spent his life turning the absurd into revelation got taken out by the oldest punchline in the book. I'm perfectly fine. It's almost as if the universe was waiting for him to say it, just so it could immediately prove him wrong. 40. Michael Jackson. More milk. Michael Jackson's final words weren't whispered like poetry or shouted like prophecy. They weren't even meant to be famous. They were practical, domestic, strangely coded. More milk. That was his nickname for the sedative that helped him sleep, the one his body ultimately couldn't handle. But if you didn't know the backstory, you'd think he was just asking for something benign. A glass of milk, the bedtime staple of every American childhood. That's the irony. The king of pop, whose life was anything but ordinary, died requesting something that sounded like it belonged in a suburban fridge. It's a phrase that, at face value, seems laughably innocent. More milk could be the request of a 5-year-old in footy pajamas, not the closing line of one of the most scrutinized and mythologized human beings on earth. But Michael was always split between two worlds: the child star who never grew up, and the global icon who was never allowed to rest. More Milk wasn't just about sedation, it was about control, escape, peace, and in a life built on spectacle, it was also a form of retreat. There's a sadness baked into that line. He wasn't asking for a curtain call. He wasn't asking for applause. He was asking for quiet, for sleep, for silence beneath the roar of a lifetime. More milk. It's so casual, so undramatic, and that's what makes it unforgettable. Because in that last moment, Michael Jackson wasn't performing, he was just tired. And if the king of pop went out whispering a code word, the next man left behind a quote that reads like a punchline with a bullet point, sharp, cynical, and still embroidered on novelty t-shirts. 41. Al Capone. You can get more with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone. Al Capone didn't invent irony. He just put it in a fedora, gave it a cigar, and made it profitable. You can get more with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone. This wasn't technically his last words, but it's the line that stuck. The one he repeated often and reportedly muttered near the end, as if trying to reassure himself that the whole strategy hadn't been a colossal mistake. Capone lived his life like a contradiction. He was a self-styled gentleman who ordered hits, a family man who ran a criminal empire, a PR-savvy operator who distributed soup to the poor and bullets to his rivals. And in that sentence, he bottled his entire worldview. It's not just a gangster quote. It's a business model. The real genius of the line isn't in the threat. It's in the logic. It's polite. It's even charming in a twisted way. It implies that kindness is still part of the equation. You just need to back it up with firepower. And that's what makes it so chilling. It's reasonable, until it isn't. Capone's words became legend because they were honest in a way most powerful people avoid. He didn't pretend the world was fair. He just adapted. And in doing so, he left behind a phrase that sounds almost philosophical: if you forget what he did with the gun. In his final years, after prison and illness took their toll, Capone faded into something softer, stranger. But the line remained, like a calling card, a final smirk carved into the mythology of America's favorite villain. And while Capone's words reek of control, the next man's last line was pure surrender, offered in a moment of defeat, or perhaps invention. Because what's more American than turning your last breath into a legend? 42. John Dillinger. You got me. If Hollywood had scripted it, this would have been the line. Simple, iconic, perfectly timed. You got me. The alleged last words of John Dillinger, America's most wanted man during the Great Depression, folk hero to some, hardened criminal to others. He was gunned down outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago, betrayed by someone close, brought down by the law he'd dodged for years. But here's the twist. He probably never said it. Still, the quote stuck. Because it feels true. Because we want it to be true. Because there's something delicious about the idea of a man so defiant, so slippery, finally accepting defeat with a grin and a shrug. You got me. It's not just a confession. It's a performance. A final bow. The romanticized outlaw tipping his hat as the credits roll. Whether he actually said it doesn't matter. The line lives on. It's part of the Dillinger myth, the American obsession with rebels, escape artists, and those who rob banks with flair. And that's the magic of it. Dillinger knew how to feed the press, how to stage a moment. His escape from jail with a carved wooden gun, possibly exaggerated, but legendary. His bank heists, lethal and theatrical. His life? A script waiting to be filmed. So it's only right that his death gets a tagline. even if it was written after the fact. You got me. A surrender, a wink, a lie, maybe all three. But in that single sentence, real or not, the legend survived the man. 43. Lee Harvey Oswald. I'm just a patsy. There are last words that end a story, and then there are last words that begin 1,000 others. I'm just a patsy belongs in the second category. Lee Harvey. Oswald didn't die quietly. He died on live television, handcuffed, flanked by cops, shot in the gut by a man with a gun and a grudge. And just days before, he'd been pulled from a movie theater and arrested for the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, a crime that rewired the entire trajectory of American history. So when he shouted, "I'm just a patsy," it wasn't poetic. It was frantic, defensive. The words of a man cornered by the weight of something far bigger than himself. A man who may or may not have pulled the trigger, but definitely understood that his name was about to be carved into infamy, and possibly not for the right reasons. What's fascinating isn't just the line itself, it's how it cracked open an entire cultural genre, conspiracy. Oswald's declaration instantly became the seed of suspicion. Was he working alone? Was he framed? Was he used? Was he lying to save himself, or telling the one honest truth in a storm of fabrication? I'm just a patsy isn't a plea. It's a claim, a refusal to carry the full weight of what just happened. And whether or not you believe him, the fact that he never got a trial, never gave a full confession, and never saw the inside of a courtroom only made the line more powerful. In death, Oswald became more than a suspect. He became a cipher. And that line, shouted in front of cameras, has echoed for decades through documentaries, books, movies, and theories layered so thick they could form a second grassy knoll. Because when you say you're a patsy, you're pointing at someone else. You're saying there's another hand, another plan, another story behind the story. And maybe there was, or maybe not. But one thing is certain, Oswald's final words didn't close the case. They opened it forever. And while he went out shouting about innocence, the next man's final word was much smaller, stranger. A whisper of agreement in the face of the void. 44. Timothy Leary. Why not? Spoken as if death was a casual experiment, Timothy Leary's final words were exactly what you'd expect from the man who told an entire generation to turn on, tune in, and drop out. Why not? 2 words, no context. Just a breezy acceptance of the inevitable, or perhaps the next trip. Leary wasn't afraid of boundaries. He actively erased them. Between science and mysticism, between medicine and psychedelics, between ego and cosmos. He was a Harvard psychologist turned counterculture prophet, and he believed in expanding the mind until it bumped into whatever came after reality. So, why not? Sounds less like resignation and more like curiosity. A shrug in the face of the great unknown, as if death wasn't an ending, just another threshold, another chemical reaction, a phase shift. Leary's whole life had been an invitation to explore what others feared. He experimented with consciousness the way physicists play with particles. And he saw death as the final test tube. Why not? Feels like the opposite of dread. It's not philosophical, it's not religious, it's casual. That's what makes it wild. He wasn't clinging, he was cruising. He once talked about death as a design problem, something humans could reframe, reprogram, even improve. And though he never solved it, he definitely rebranded it. So when the final moment came, Leary didn't ask for comfort. He didn't offer reflection. He just said the one thing every experimenter must eventually ask: why not? And then, like any good scientist, he left without finishing the report. But if Leary embraced the unknown, The next man was caught somewhere between the physical and the political. A power figure whose last words weren't mystic or cryptic, but deeply human and maybe just a little desperate. 45. Richard Nixon. Help me. Richard Nixon's presidency ended with a helicopter and a wave, a peace sign held high. A man disgraced, yet smiling like the main character of a tragedy he hadn't read to the end. But his final known words, spoken decades later, were far smaller. Help me. No speeches, no grand reflections on China or Russia or Watergate. Just a simple, instinctual plea. It's the most human thing he ever said. Help me isn't a political statement. It's not layered. It's not rehearsed. It's what you say when everything else has failed, when the body betrays the mind, when the calculations stop working, when even legacy doesn't return your calls. And that's what makes it hit so hard, because Nixon was a man of control, of power, of shadowy moves and silent victories. He lived in a world of chess, not checkers, a master of indirectness, of plausible deniability, of complex machinery built to keep him above the fray. But death doesn't negotiate, and in the end, there were no spin doctors in the room, no press conferences, no lawyers, just Nixon, and the one sentence no one could spin, help me. It's tempting to read meaning into it. Maybe it was physical, a request to a nurse, a final strain for breath. But in a broader sense, it feels like the last gasp of a man who'd spent his whole life trying to avoid saying that exact thing. A man who'd spent decades pretending he didn't need help, suddenly asking for it finally when nothing else could be done. And if there's any justice in final words, maybe that's the most honest line Richard Nixon ever delivered. 46. Jeffrey Dahmer. I don't care if I live or die. Go ahead and kill me. Some last words are mysterious. Some are ironic. Some echo like poetry. This one is hollow. I don't care if I live or die. Go ahead and kill me. Spoken not in a dramatic courtroom or on a deathbed, but reportedly to another inmate, not long before he was beaten to death. There's no nuance in it. No symbolism. Just a flat line of apathy from a man whose life had already gone dark long before it ended. It's tempting to try and parse meaning from a line like this, to squint at it until it resembles remorse, or a philosophical reckoning. But this wasn't a confession. It wasn't an apology. It was just detachment, the final proof that, in the end, even Jeffrey Dahmer didn't see anything left to preserve. And maybe that's the strangest part. A man who once inflicted terror, now submitting to it. Not defiantly, not heroically, just emptily. I don't care if I live or die. There's no resistance in the phrase, no tension. It doesn't scream or weep. It just exists. The moral equivalent of a shrug. And it reflects what many said about Dahmer in his final years. That he had become a man hollowed out, almost eerily passive, no longer fighting his fate, and maybe not even understanding it. He had reportedly accepted his punishment, embraced it even. He asked for no special treatment, made no effort to protect himself. Go ahead and kill me. Not as a dare, not as bravado, just as an allowance. It's disturbing, not just because of who he was, but because of how ordinary those words sound coming from someone so notoriously abnormal. He sounded like someone who had finally stopped pretending to be anything at all. And that's what makes it unsettling. The most monstrous people are often remembered for the horrors they created. But sometimes their last words are horrifying in a quieter way, because they show you just how little was left inside. But if Dahmer's words reflected surrender, the next man's were pure contradiction, a riddle without context, like a fortune cookie scribbled by a mad prophet. 47. Charles Manson, you are what you do. No one ever really knew what Charles Manson meant by most of what he said, and his last reported words didn't change that. You are what you do. It sounds simple, even motivational, something you'd see on a gym wall or printed on a coffee mug in an office trying to inspire productivity. But coming from him, it doesn't land quite so cleanly. Manson had spent a lifetime bending language into spirals, using philosophy like a crowbar, smashing logic into tiny shards and then throwing them at anyone who got too close. So when he said, "You are what you do," it wasn't a clean moral statement. It was a kind of dare. A final echo of the persona he'd built. Cult leader, manipulator, deviant poet, avatar of chaos. It could have been a confession, or an accusation, or both. He had always denied direct responsibility for the murders his followers committed, even as he claimed to be their moral compass. So maybe these final words were a sly backtrack, finally acknowledging that yes, actions define the man. Not words, not charisma, not ideology. Or maybe he was talking to us. A final middle finger, spoken through a New Age poster slogan. A warning, a reminder, or a joke. You are what you do. A strange thing to say from a man who, in the end, did very little himself, but orchestrated actions that shattered lives, redefined evil, and echoed through decades of cultural memory. And yet, the line is correct, maybe uncomfortably so. Manson's entire persona was built on manipulation, convincing others to do what he never would. But in his final breath, he cut through the nonsense. You are what you do, and what he did defined him forever. Which brings us to a strange twist in this otherwise grim parade. A fictional detour. A test. A trapdoor. 48. James Brown. I'm going away tonight. The godfather of soul didn't leave quietly. He left with rhythm. I'm going away tonight. That's what James Brown told his longtime manager, Charles Bobbitt, in the early hours before his death. It wasn't a plea or a complaint. It wasn't dramatic. It was almost rehearsed. Like a lyric. Like a line he'd sung before. Just never this final. There's a kind of clean theatricality to it. Not I'm dying, not this is it, but I'm going away. It's the kind of phrase you'd expect from a showman. Gentle, but final. A curtain call dressed as a casual departure. Brown spent his whole life on stage, commanding audiences like a general, sweating through performances with supernatural energy, inventing entire genres as side effects of his need to move, scream, be. Even in his final days, he was planning shows, booking flights, pushing onward like time itself had to hustle to keep up with him. So when he said, I'm going away tonight, there was no panic in it. Just certainty. Intention. It was the way you might announce a gig in a new city, not a departure from life. The timing of it all is eerie. He wasn't supposed to die that night. He was ill, yes, but there were plans, conversations, things still undone. But James Brown had always had a sixth sense for performance, for endings that felt choreographed, even when they weren't. Maybe he knew something the rest didn't. Or maybe, after decades of defying expectations, he just finally decided it was time to rest. What makes the line so striking is its simplicity. So many public figures try to fight death with metaphors or resistance. Brown didn't fight. He just informed, like it was the next logical step. And the words linger not just because of who said them, but how he said them, quietly, directly, with an odd sense of peace. James Brown, whose voice once shook arenas and bent genres into new shapes, left the world not with a scream, but with a sentence. A final beat in a song no one else could sing. And with that, the music faded.